A second person's died following a house explosion in Newcastle. The body of a man was found in the debris in Benwell yesterday. A 7-year-old boy also died. Our reporter Emily Craigie has more.
We've also had an update on those taken to hospital. 4 adults and a child have now been released, but a man in his 30s remains in a critical but stable condition. Emergency services do remain on the scene here with a large cordon in place, and an investigation at what caused it is ongoing.
The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's told LBC he welcomes Labour's review of the former government's position on HS2. It's after we revealed this morning that a version of the high-speed line could run from Euston to Crewe.
I'm encouraged that people are at least talking about this. I don't think it's HS2 is back. It's probably more likely son or daughter of HS2, a different way of connecting the West Midlands and the North West of England. But the fact that the conversation's being had, I think, is really positive news.
Police in Argentina say they found alcohol and prescription drugs in Liam Payne's hotel room, which they also described as being in disarray. The former One Direction singer died last night after falling from his hotel balcony. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 56 points at 83.85. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.20. LBC weather mostly dry this evening and overnight with lengthy clear spells. Colder than last night and turning windier in the northwest with a low of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
8:02 on LBC. We're going to talk about poverty today. It's the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. It's the United Nations official day. And I must admit, I was quite taken aback last night when I posted a graphic about the fact that we were doing this today. And it was headline, it wasn't my headline, it just said poverty phone-in. And some people interpreted that as though we were almost relishing sort of doing this in terms of poverty. It's a bit like, do you remember that programme Benefit Street where it was described as poverty porn? And that is exactly the antithesis of my intention for this hour, because I want to talk about the word poverty, what it means in 21st century Britain, what it means in the world today. Because I think it is a word that means different things to different people, and it's taken on a sort of a rather elastic meaning, I think. We talk about relative poverty, we talk about absolute poverty, and I'm not sure whether that's really very helpful when people don't necessarily know what the difference is between the two. So we've got 2 guests with us for the next hour, and they are hopefully delighted to hear your phone calls if you'd like to give us a call. They are Lord John Bird, crossbench peer, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of The Big Issue. He was homeless as a child and again in his 20s. John, welcome back to LBC. And Matthew Torbitt, homelessness campaigner who slept rough himself as a teenager. Good to see you again, Matthew, as well. Let's talk about this word poverty, because John, you've published a piece today where you say that one of the questions that you're asked most is sort of what would be the first thing you do about poverty, and what does it mean? What does the word mean to you?
Poverty means not being able to do things that you would expect. Go to the toilet. I was born into a house where we shared the toilet with 8 other London Irish families. So if you wanted to have a crap, you had to book it 2 days ahead. That's poverty.
Yeah.
Poverty is where you're in a room with your family, and there's one electric light, and there's windows that don't fit, and there's rats and mice and lice and all that sorts of stuff. So I often, people say to me, and it's nearly always someone with a posh voice, they'll say, "Don't you mean absolute poverty or poverty?" And I say, "Look,
I was just about to come to that."
Sorry, you got the wrong voice. So I just don't get involved in it. I know poverty when it comes upon me, when I meet it, when I meet people who can't make ends meet. Where I would say poverty is different now from when I started The Big Issue is that there's an increasing amount. It's almost like there's poverty in the middle, and then there's these radiations. So you can have poverty which is very, very deep in the middle and can get shallower towards the end. And I think there are more people coming into it.
Do you think there's a lot of hidden poverty? Because you say you recognise poverty when you see it. Well, I mean, you can do that, but I think particularly in richer areas of the country, there is hidden poverty which we don't observe. I mean, I live in a very rich town, Tunbridge Wells, but there are real pockets of poverty there, but nobody talks about it because they don't see it every day.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of, I would say there's almost cleaned up poverty. I've known people who you would never know they're in poverty, but if you look very closely at their clothes or their shoes, you can see however smart they look, they've darned it up, they've kept the front of their house, cleaned their windows, washed their curtains, but they haven't got a receptacle to urinate in, if you see what I mean.
I do. Well saved there, I thought. Matthew, same question to you. What's your sort of definition of this word?
I think it can be materialistic, as John said. I think it also comes with different feelings. I think with poverty, there's a sense of shame, there's a sense of desperation, mental anguish and torment. And I think because the class system is a lot more fluid than maybe it was when John started the big issue, I think poverty can actually be hard to define in that instance, because I think people can flip between different classes quite quickly if you're going off how much money people earn or places people may live. And I actually think some people don't realise how poor they actually are. Because I think back to the late 80s or maybe the mid 80s when Margaret Thatcher deregulated the financial markets and credit became more easily accessible. I think back when John started the big issue, you were largely poor or sort of doing all right, well off, but you were dirt poor. I think because you can book a holiday on a credit card, you can get a car on finance, DFS will give you a sofa or any other sort of similar thing, and you don't have to pay for 2 years. People don't quite realise how poor they are because they can get that accessible credit. So I think there's layers to it, and when John speaks about the radiations that come out of it, I think that's right as well. Theresa May famously spoke on the steps of Downing Street about the just about managing, and that's the people that are struggling to get by. And again, you might not realise it because they look all right from the outside, or they may speak a certain way, or they are just about managing. It doesn't mean there isn't poverty underneath that.
The text's already coming in. Simon says, "What is poverty?" asks ignorant of Tunbridge Wells. No, it's my job to ask questions. I've always thought that the ultimate definition of poverty is where you cannot house yourself or your family, you cannot afford to eat, you cannot afford to clothe yourself or your family, or you cannot afford to heat the house. I mean, that covers a multitude of things there. But if you are subject to any of those, to me, that means you are in real poverty. But Matthew, you're talking about sort of a lot of materialistic things there, and we have become a very materialistic society. Maybe we always have been, I don't know. But you can't define poverty as not being able to afford a Sky TV subscription, can you?
Somebody might. I think, again, things have changed. If you'd have said 10, 15 years ago that a mobile phone was a necessity, people would laugh at you. Now, the idea of doing things like applying for universal credit if you're out of work, it's all internet-based, and we are largely online in 2024. So I think that's the difference as well. It was obviously the age-old thing that if you had a sort of touchscreen phone or a flat-screen TV, you couldn't be in poverty, and that's not necessarily true, because there may be other things you've gone without. Now, people at home may well say, well, they should sell the TV and whatever. I just think, why can you not be allowed nice things? We're here on this planet for a very short time. People make poor financial decisions as well, myself included, don't get me wrong. Sky TV, I'm not so sure, but then are you missing out on what's going on?
Broadband, though. I mean, broadband is now an essential to everybody, isn't it?
But surely the other thing is, which I think you've touched on, Matthew, is it's also about your own personal comprehension. So if you can't afford a flat screen or to go on the internet, and you're surrounded by people who are doing it, and it's so much a part of everyday life, then that may be the thing that really makes you feel depressed, even more depressed sometimes than the ability to eat, the right food. So you might cut down on food, and you'll have yourself a broadband or whatever. I'm kind of pre-digital, so even though I've got a phone, but
So you're not. You're not. Really.
I am pre-digital, I promise you. But interestingly, we've done a lot of work on how's the best way to define poverty in the way that it affects our lives. And I would say the best way is to look at the NHS, because if you look at the NHS and you took poverty out of the NHS, where 50% of people who suffer from cardiac illnesses or are in hospital, 50% of them are suffering from food poverty. So actually, if you want to know what poverty feels like, go to a hospital. Go to most hospitals and you will see the poor stuck there and suffering from all the illnesses that come from inherited poverty, because most poverty is inherited, passed from generation to generation. And therefore, poverty really does destroy the well-being of our country. And I would say that because of the NHS, we really are in a situation that it's almost difficult to imagine a time when we could return to having a reasonable amount of people ill, a reasonable amount of people using the NHS, rather than the enormous amount of people that are doing it. Can I just tell you one thing? In Wales, this is what I heard from a Welsh MP. In Wales, there are about 3 million people. There are 2 million people waiting for an NHS appointment. So Wales is obviously
two-thirds of the population
are there. I mean, there might be some duplications, but if you take the duplications out, you might end up with 1 million people in a population of 3 million. So health is really, really central. And I would say one of the reasons is because people are suffering from food poverty and they're suffering from an inability to participate in society.
Mark in Ayr says, if I'm going to talk about poverty, I might bother to learn the difference between absolute and relative poverty. Well, I don't know what I've said to provoke that, because I think I do know the difference between the two, but there we go. I want to talk a little bit about rural poverty, because it goes back to what we were saying about hidden poverty, because I think in rural areas it is hidden. I always remember hearing John Gummer make a speech, as donkeys years ago, where he said poverty is considered quaint in rural areas because it comes thatched, which is, I mean, an amusing comment, but I kind of know what he meant by that, because it is hidden. That you sort of have the you live in a nice little village with nice houses, but behind the doors things are very, very different. And I think a lot of people think that poverty is a sort of urban issue, and it just isn't, is it?
I don't think so, and I think I mean I can only speak so much having grown up in a town, in an urban town, but. I mean, I remember the EFRA Select Committee looking at things like this last year. And actually, I think if you're potentially in poverty in a rural community or area, there could be a greater sense of shame, because you seem to be in a real minority there, or that's what it could be perceived as when you're looking at the rest of the community around you. And therefore, is the support system set up there for that? Because the idea is if you're putting government funding out in targeted regional areas, we are going to put it in the more denser, more populated areas, your Londons, your Greater Manchesters, West Midlands, places like Tunbridge Wells. They're not going to get a look in. And in fact, there might be a greater need for it per capita of person.
Tell us a bit about your story.
So my story is, me and my mum and dad didn't really get on growing up. I'm the eldest of 4. And I always think the eldest gets it the hardest, because they're the sort of
I agree.
the first child. They're learning almost how to be parents and stuff like that. And it got to a point where there was a relationship breakdown, and I ended up on the streets of Manchester as a teenager. I slept on the streets of Manchester for 12 months, and during that time, I was groomed into a gang, which I'd say a little bit naive about. I don't think it's an excuse. But for me, I was so desperate and so fed up and so upset that I'd have done pretty much anything to put a roof over my head and feel safe. That eventually caught up with me, and I was sentenced to 12 months in prison which was suspended for 12 months as a first-time offence, and I did 180 community hours. Now, the reason I'm sat here in front of you today and not sat in a prison cell or worse is because my best friend's mum and dad, Dawn and Paul, took me in, and that basically shapes my thesis on tackling homelessness. It came from opportunity, support and education. The opportunity of being given that warm, loving home. Not that my mum and dad weren't loving, I'm not saying that. But they were willing to give me that support in a time of need. The opportunity came from them understanding the system, which I'd never... Mum and dad always worked. They were stereotypically working class. Mum was a cleaner, dad was a postie. My best friend's mum and dad, degree educated, had a child with a disability, knew how to navigate the system. So I was encouraged to go to college, get my GCSEs, go to university. And education was the whole point. It made me political. I got on my soapbox about the fact that I felt as much of a victim as some of the victims of the crimes that were perpetrated, and I couldn't get on with the rest of my life because of this criminal record that was hanging over me. So from that, I became very political, and until last week was a political advisor for the Labour Party for the last 7 years, working for frontbench Labour MPs. So I think the proof is in the pudding.
Which is how we met.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think it's so important not to give up on people, because the amount of lives lost, as we've seen again this week with figures released on last year, where deaths of people rough sleeping is up 42% on the year before. There is so much human potential and life being wasted that could otherwise be doing such amazing things. And that's why I'll be forever grateful to Dawn, Paul, Josh and Finn, who took me in during that time. They didn't have to. They could have... We've got other things to do. They were hardly flush with money, but that's why I am so passionate about, one, trying to end homelessness. I think it can be done. People will say it's a bit of a pipe dream, but I think you've got to try these things, and I think places like Finland have proven you can, or thereabouts, and that we need... I'm grateful for people like yourselves giving things like this a platform to talk about this, because I think also there's a miseducation on homeless people. You look at Suella Braverman's comments last year as Home Secretary, saying that it's a lifestyle choice and that if we ban tents, it'll probably solve the issue. There's a huge miseducation on why people are there, how they may have ended up there, and actually the dehumanisation that comes with that.
Right, we'll take a break, and I want to explore a couple of the issues that you've mentioned, and also want to talk to you, John, about how typical Matthew's story is. I mean, you will have come across all sorts of people from different backgrounds who fall into homelessness for whatever reason, and hopefully at some point emerge from it and make something of their lives, which is what Matthew has obviously done. But we'll come to that in just a moment, and we'll take your calls, 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
We asked Co-op members what
Britain's Conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8 on LBC. We have Lord John Bird with us in the studio, crossbench peer, the founder and editor-in-chief of The Big Issue, and Matthew Torbitt, the homelessness campaigner. We don't just want to talk about poverty as a sort of abstract term. I want to sort of explore also what can be done to alleviate or even eradicate poverty. Now, you just mentioned, Matthew, Finland there. What have the Finns done that we're not doing?
Housing first is the approach. So housing first, the Finns brought in 2008. And the idea is, it says what it does what it says on the tin, in that you get your house first. There are sometimes preconditions here and across the EU where, in order for you to gain a tenancy through the local authority or charities or what it is, third sector, you may have to come clean if you've got alcohol issues, drug issues, any sort of mental health. The biggest barrier to that is, how are you expected to clean yourself up whilst you're on the street? It's just not going to happen. It's the hardest thing you can probably do. So in 2008, they brought in the Housing First model. And by 2020, rough sleeping is essentially finished. There is no rough sleeping in Finland. And people, they successfully trialled it in the UK over the last 3 or 4 years. Greater Manchester trialled it as a local authority, Liverpool City region and the West Midlands. 94% of people that took part stayed in those secure tenancies and will hopefully go on to have much improved lives. The proof's in the pudding. The problems you may find, and which, I won't expect much from Rachel Reeves at the end of the month, is because it's quite costly. I think the idea is you invest in the house building, which we haven't got, and that was what one of the things that came out of the trial is, we probably haven't got the houses to do it at the moment. And that hasn't stopped Andy Burnham saying he wants to do it and he would like the money from Rachel Reeves to try and roll it out across Greater Manchester. But the proof's in the pudding, and the idea is that you reap the rewards afterwards, so it's more cost efficient than the costly B&B and temporary accommodation situation that we have, which is costing billions a year. And the health impact of people that are living on the streets, and the fact that people may end up in prison or sentenced to prison like I was, and therefore you're paying £50,000 per year per prisoner. You could save all that money by housing people.
John, what do you make of that?
Well, I have to say that I've had quite a bit to do with Housing First, and I watched it grow from the United States, was where it started, and then Finland took it up. I think it's a brilliant idea. We kind of tried it in the early days of The Big Issue. We went into partnership with a housing association who was going to provide the wraparound skills and support, and we raised the money for the houses. Unfortunately, the housing association, who will remain nameless, didn't deliver the wraparound. So within a year, they proved really in a positive sort of way that if you don't provide the wraparound support, then you're lumbered. We made a film last year or the year before where we went round and looked at all sorts of opportunities for intervention in housing and homelessness. We went to Scotland, where Scotland was doing it, very limited, but was putting it into practice. The only thing I would say, and I say this as a kind of self-appointed historian, we've got to remember we are not an agricultural country. We are not a country full of reindeers. We are a collapsed, failed, imperial, ex-industrial nation. And many of the problems that are thrown up by homelessness and by the inheritance of poverty is because we're carrying this terrible kind of burden, where we were the first nation to take people from the countryside, drive them into the cities 250 years ago to get jobs in mills, and then watch themselves and their children die very young. And that inherited trauma is still with us. I see that inherited trauma when I see the riots a couple of months ago. I see this kind of anger amongst it. So I think there's a lot of really deep psychological damage that's been done to the UK. And that's why one of the reasons we are a home now of all the major G7s. We are the home of people who are suffering mental health issues. And we need to grow up and wake up and address those mental health issues, which are beyond homelessness and everywhere. And I don't see anybody doing it. But I do believe that one of the shortcuts you can do is to take the model, the American model, pass through the prism of Finland and use it. But as Matthew says, it costs an arm and a leg immediately. And this government and the last government didn't believe in spend to save. That's, I think, the big problem.
Given that Britain is the 6th biggest economy in the world, a lot of people will say, well, how can that be? How can we be one of the richest countries in the world? And then we hear Matthew saying that rough sleeping has gone up by 42% in a year.
Deaths.
That's the deaths
of rough sleepers.
That's the amount of people dying on our streets.
But the actual amount has also gone up, hasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it
gone up by 23%. I think it might be the last 6 months.
So why would that be? And I mean, OK, we can all say because the government isn't sort of instituting the right policies or spending enough money. But why is that?
How long have you got? I think if I try and put it
33 minutes.
If I try and put it in a nutshell, one of the big aspects is people's mental health. The support isn't there. That can end up in breakdowns of relationships and situations like that, and people end up on the streets. Lack of affordable housing. People's ending up in situations where they can't pay their rent and they're chased out of their houses and end up on the streets. Trauma. One of the big things that we need to start looking at is preventative rather than trying to plaster over when it's done. I think you look at people that come through the social services and childcare sector and end up on the streets or in prisons. Prisons is another one. People that are released from prison 15 years ago, you used to have somebody within the prison system in each prison that 2 months before you were released would look at houses for you, almost like you would bid for a house if you were outside on the as part of the social housing schemes. That's not there anymore. You are released with about £47 worth of a train voucher, and that's it. There's no catch up, and that's due to partly austerity, I would say, and partly cuts.
That was happening way before that. I mean, I remember back in what it would have been about 2003 in Norfolk, being taken round a drug rehabilitation centre, and then 6 months later, just coincidentally meeting one of the guys that was in there, and he was in there to actually talk to other people about his experience, and he'd been in prison. And I just saw him in Sainsbury's in North Walsham, and I said, "Well, how's it going?" And he said, "Well, I'm back on the drugs." And I said, "Well, how have you let that happen? Because you were clean, you were teaching others about your experience." He said, "Because when I got out of prison, I was put in a hostel in Kings Lynn, and everyone else in there was on drugs."
Well, that is another big issue.
Talk about a joined-up society.
I used to feel, this is really sad, I used to feel safer on the streets than in hostels.
Yeah, well, I mean, how bad is that?
They should change it. They shouldn't call them hostels. They should call them hostiles.
Yeah.
Because it is a really dangerous place. Can I because I've been doing this for so long, and I'm not necessarily saying I've done it brilliantly for so long, but I keep asking the questions, why have we not kicked a hole in poverty? Why have we not? And as I keep talking about the inheritance, I inherited poverty. My parents couldn't organise urination in a whatever. They were absolutely useless, and they were useless because they didn't know how to look after money. They didn't know the importance of education. When my Irish mother took me to the school gate, she said, "Get in there and don't muck about, not get in there and get educated." And when you see all that, and then, so you've got all this kind of leftover people who are not really covered by the welfare state. And then you see the fact that, and I don't want to sound too technical here, but 80% of what our banks do is in the buying and selling of private property. All of the big money in Britain, all of the big social opportunities, the social mobility, is in the buying and selling of property. So if all of our money, if the crown jewels or the family jewels are in property, and that's the way that people make their living and make their mortgages, and make their pensions and all that, then that makes any housing almost increasingly difficult for people to adhere to and get hold of. And I believe that until we break the monopoly of housing, and the only way to do that is produce enough housing which is cheap as chips, and it shouldn't be built for 100 years, it should be built for 10, 20, 30 years. Go back to the post-war where you had prefabs that lasted for 50 years.
I've been saying that for years. I mean, these German, I don't know if you're familiar with the German Hofhäuser.
Yes.
Which, to you and I, would be quite luxurious. But because they've got this word prefab associated with them, people think, it's like after the war, sort of the quality of building. But they are brilliant, and they cost a fraction to build of what a normal house does.
Prefabrication is the answer. There's a big company, Legal & General. They started a prefabrication business which could have revolutionised much house development, could have led to all sorts of things. But the problem is the planning. You can't get the planning through. You can't get the local authorities. You can't get the finance for it. So until we start talking about transitional housing, that is housing that takes you through a period. I mean, most students who go to the college, the university, they live in piss-poor conditions for a couple of years.
No, it's not 9 o'clock, John. You can't use words like that.
I thought it was
Apologies for anyone who's offended.
Forgive me.
That's all right.
I write a disclaimer. But let's open up the whole idea. You can build a house for £30,000 and it can last for 20 years, 30 years. The only thing is the land. So why not buy the land? Why not just borrow the land? And there's so much land out there that is available.
Liam in Sevenoaks is having a go at me here. He says, no one needs 12 acres because my house has got 12 acres around it. So gift them to shelter so they can be used for housing. Nah, thought not. I've looked into building houses on this land, but because it's classed, I mean, I think it's a joke, an area of outstanding natural beauty, because it really genuinely isn't. It's got a housing estate on one side and an old people's home on another. How it can be classed as that, I do not know. And it's impossible to get any sort of planning permission, and I was quite happy to have 100% affordable housing. The answer is just no. So, and people have had that experience. So if this government can change the planning system to encourage house building, they'll have my full support, I'll tell you. Anyway, we'll come to your calls in a moment to our two guests, John Bird and Matthew Torbitt, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:33 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Israel's Prime Minister says evil has suffered a heavy blow after confirming the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. The 62-year-old's thought to have been the mastermind behind the October the 7th attacks. The wife of a Conservative councillor in Northamptonshire has been jailed for more than 2.5 years after using social media to stir up racial hatred. Lucy Connolly called for the hotel's housing asylum seekers to be set on fire on the day of the Southport attacks. A second person's died following a house explosion in Newcastle. The body of a man was found in the debris in Benwell yesterday. LBC weather mostly dry this evening and overnight with lengthy clear spells. Colder than last night and turning windier in the northwest, a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC.
Remember the good
on LBC.
8:36. It is the United Nations International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. I have to say that's quite an awkward title for a day, isn't it? I can't think of anything better, but it doesn't sort of trip off the tongue, does it? We have Lord John Bird with us, crossbench peer who's the founder and editor-in-chief of The Big Issue, and Matthew Torbitt, the homelessness campaigner. Right, let's go to your calls, because we're talking about poverty and maybe how to alleviate it, how to eradicate it. 0345 6060 973. Michael's in Rains Park. Hello, Michael.
Good evening there, Iain, and good evening to your guests. My question to your guests, and I know, Iain, that we've spoken about this issue a little bit in the past, but your guests have spoken about the possibility of ending homelessness. Well, I'd like to ask them about the possibility, focusing on rough sleeping, about the possibility of banning rough sleeping by getting the police to detain rough sleepers and take them to accommodation and treatment centres. I've done the maths.
Do you really think that? Do you really think that's the role of the police?
Well, hear me out, Iain. I've done the maths on this. According to Crisis, there are 10,000 rough sleepers per year at the moment, about 4,000 on any one night. And an expenditure of £5 billion would equate to £50,000 per rough sleeper, which I think should be able to provide decent treatment. Because the point is that it's not just about for the benefit of the rough sleepers themselves, who I don't think should be sleeping rough on the street, especially in the cold months. But I mean, here in Rains Park, we've got about one or two rough sleepers who sleep down at the train station in the tunnels, and I've seen on Nextdoor. They've been given all kinds of help they've been provided accommodation, they've been provided some treatment for their issues, but they always seem to end up back on the street. And I just worry that rough sleepers are becoming too much of a feature of our streets, and no one seems to object to it anymore.
Okay, Matthew.
Yes, so banning rough sleepers. The government looked at doing something like this in the criminal justice bill before the last parliament. They wanted to round up people based on whether they smelt. That would become illegal if they were deemed as a nuisance.
I'd love to see the law drafted about sort of how someone smells.
That was always my point. I think it's all well and good saying, have the police round them up and take them to accommodation or support services. Where are they? There's a reason why this isn't happening. And I think it would concern me that the police were doing this. Why are we not having local authority mental health supporters going to see them instead and taking them to places? Why has it got to be the police? I can only assume, and Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's because he doesn't like to see it. None of us like to see it, but I think the idea that it is in some way a crime or should be frowned upon, these people need support. They don't need to be, rounded up and taken off by the police like some sort of 1834 poor law reenactment. I think with regards to the maths, it is probably about 50 grand per rough sleeper. And the money could be used elsewhere. But the problem is we don't currently have the accommodation. And I know it's very easy for someone like me on the left to blame Margaret Thatcher for everything. She, with the right to buy scheme that she set up in the 80s, I thought was a good idea. I think it's amazing to be able to own your own home and have that possibility given to you or the opportunity there. I think the problem is we didn't build anymore, and everybody seems to understand that now. And if the supply was there, the demand would surely go down. I think since the scheme was brought in, we sold 2 million of those houses on Right to Buy. We've only built 1 million more social houses, so we're already 50% down. So I think there's a few different things there, but I think Michael's barking up the wrong tree slightly.
I can remember in my first years on LBC, say 2010 to 2015, Westminster City Council, which is the council obviously that controls the central part of London where the homelessness problem is probably at its most acute, they had a scheme where they guaranteed that every rough sleeper could have a bed if they wanted one. Now, I don't know if they still run that or not, but I thought at that point, I mean, that seemed to be the way to go. If you want to get people off the streets, then you have to offer them accommodation. Now, whether they take it up or not, and there will always be some people, you tell me if I'm wrong, but there will always be some people who decide not to take it up for whatever reason. I think we saw that in COVID, where, I mean, homelessness almost was eradicated during COVID, but there would always be a few people who didn't trust the authorities or for whatever mental health reasons decided that they would not avail themselves of that. Is that what we've got to encourage all councils to do, to provide the accommodation if people want it?
Well, I think I come from the days when what Michael, is it Michael of Rains Park? I come from the days when that's exactly what the police did. So when I was a young runaway and a rough sleeper in the 50s and the early 60s, then if I was caught, I would have been taken to the magistrate and the beak would have sent me down for 3 months, 30 days and all that.
Well, you've actually been sent to prison or a young offenders institution.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't, because I was very good at hiding. Around Leicester Square was one of our favourite places. But the problem was the magistrate said, look, we're putting these people, they're coming in, we're putting them into prisons and all that, and then we're letting them out and they're coming back. So it's a revolving door. So the magistrates took the law into their own hands and said, we're saying case dismissed. So the police stopped picking people up, rough sleepers and beggars. So those were the two lots of people that the police, and in my opinion, what it allowed, and this is a contradictory thing to say from most people, they allowed the creation of a human justice violation, which is people sleeping on the streets. To me, it's not a criminal issue. It's an issue of the violation of people's rights. And when people say to me, but I want to sleep on the streets, there'll be all sorts of reasons why they want to sleep on the streets. In the early days of Blair, when Blair was creating bigger and bigger and bigger homeless organisations to build more and more hostels and rough sleepers flats, but not getting the demons out of people's minds of why people ended up in the streets. So to me, it was a wallpapering job. All it did was it made rough sleeping, wet homelessness into dry homelessness. And people like me were saying, unless you get people and give them therapeutic communities, which is what Michael's talking about, where you give people the opportunity to make change in their lives, great. But you also have to use the Mental Health Act. If somebody's out on the streets and are going to live 15 to 20 years less than us, are dying in front of us, then we have a responsibility under the Mental Health Act to take those people and put them, even if it is against their own wishes, in a place of safety so that they themselves can be saved from early death and the destructions of street life.
OK, Michael, thank you very much for the call. We'll take more in just a moment. It's 9:15.
This is LBC.
OK, which is clear.
0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:48 on LBC. John Bird, Matthew Torbitt with us. Let's talk to Kevin in Basingstoke. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Ian.
What would you like to say?
My question is, 50 richest families in the UK have more wealth than the bottom 35 million people. I can't see this ever reversing or slowing down. But how can we solve this problem?
What do you suggest?
Well, what do I suggest? Better government, taxing the wealthy. But, I mean, they have so much power, so much influence, I don't think it's possible. They own most of the media.
Do they? Okay. John?
I kind of disagree with most people about this forced levelling. And it's not because I'm a Tory or I'm a Labour or whatever. But I think most of the argument around poverty is always about what can we do about the poor. And actually, if you continue to go on about the emergency of poverty and the fact that there are 50 people owning all this, if you're always going on about this and you're not building the apparatus to turn the tap off, to reduce, so you get a churn, you get people falling into poverty and coming out. When you don't have a government that centralises and converges the energy that is necessary to get rid of poverty, which is 40% of their income going down in poverty, when you've got 8 government departments all got a finger in the poverty pie, then you're always going to be having initiative here, initiative there, and you're going to have all sorts of things. I believe that until we move or much of our energy towards breaking the inheritance of poverty so that we turn the tap off, 90% of the people I've ever worked from have come from the same socio-economic group, the one that I came from, and there was a predictability of failure. This is a 20-year, 30-year, 40-year job. No governments shy away from 20 or 30 or 40 years, unless they're building an airport or a channel tunnel. They don't embrace the idea that, as Matthew was talking about earlier, which is the spend to save, because you end up having incredibly expensive poor people. They are incredibly, it's so expensive keeping people poor. So therefore you have to turn, so prevention becomes the big thing. Prevention is going to cure the NHS. It's not going to be done by clever pieces of emergency.
You just reminded me of a conversation I had earlier today. The Labour MP, Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan, she's on my For the Many podcast, which is, I think, will go live in a couple of hours. And she was talking about some school children in her constituency who she and others got to go to an England football match at Wembley. And they were like sort of 7, 8, 9 years old. And they'd seen in a previous match these seats were empty, so they just got in touch with the FA and they said, well, can we bring some of our children? Because they will have never been to anything like this. And she said one of the kids was holding the hand of a teacher so tightly that the teacher said, why are you sort of grabbing me so tightly? And the little, I'm going to get emotional now, the little child said, because this is like a dream. People like me don't get to do this.
Yeah, God bless.
And it's those people, those kids, they have to be given the chance, don't they? They have to be able to dream. They have to be able to have the aspirations that any other kid would have. And if they don't have it, in a sense, a proportion of them are destined to the life that you've been talking about.
Why not give the poorest amongst us a Rolls-Royce service at the most important part? Let's lavish on them opportunity, because if you don't, they will cost millions and millions and millions of pounds until they die. I've got members of my family who've cost millions of pounds, and I tell you what, I wish they'd made the investment in my brothers and their children earlier on, and that's what you're saying.
Right, let's go to Max in Camden. Hello, Max.
Hi, and lovely to talk to you as always.
Hi.
I'll be try to be as succinct as possible. I think your guest is absolutely wonderful. I agree with so much of his perception in terms of he was talking earlier about the post-imperial guilt and the kind of inherited problems that occur from lots of different situations. I think my point is this, that just very, very briefly, I went through a sort of bad patch and ended up in a YMCA on my own with nothing, and everyone was completely crazy. It was a bit like being in prison in Crouch End. And got out of it, skimmed through, and I'm fine. Well, I'm absolutely fine. So my point is this, though. I think, isn't it a case of asking the individual, if you get into a safe place, hearing their story so far, their life story, and saying, do you want to change? Because I think the personal motivation of people is so important to kindle. That's my point. I don't know if you agree.
Okay.
In other words,
Well, let's hear from Matthew.
First of all, Max, well done. You've done really well to get out of that bad patch and be where you are now. You should be proud of yourself. It's no mean feat when you're going.
But when you were in that bad patch, did you think to yourself, I am going to get out of this, or did you fear that you were going to be trapped in it?
You don't see the end. You don't see. You'll set me off in a minute. It's hard to see the hope when you're in that situation. To try and paint a reality of it, you're being urinated on. You're being beaten up. You're being seen as less than other. You're losing friends who are being murdered because they're having their tent set on fire and you don't know who's next. Then you've got the police bothering you. You've got other people bothering you. And you don't think you're ever going to get out, and you're almost praying. And actually, the thing I've always said to people, the worst part about being homeless and sleeping on the street is waking up every morning, because it's all started again for that. Those 10 seconds that you're waking up, you could be anywhere again, and then you've got to relive the whole thing again and try and survive. I think Max's point is fair. Where do you begin with it, I suppose? Has Max got any ideas of what he thinks he would do?
Max?
I think I would, if I was in a situation where I was able to provide the facilities for people to come in and really share their stories, not on a kind of, and I'm an office worker, and what's your situation, but on a really kind of cool level, not even on a kind of, and there's some anger in the room kind of thing, but just more of a friendly-ish area. And just say, what's your story? What do you want? In other words, try and get some motivation from the individuals to change.
So I think what most people will say, I would almost say 99% of people want an opportunity. That's what they want, and they want to make a change. And the problem is, I had a debate on this with an MP recently who said, slightly off tangent, but we were talking about prisons. And he was saying, the Labour Party and other parties want to do things like community sentencing. We should be tough on crime. And I then went on to explain my story. And he said, oh, no, I'll give you full credit for the way you turned your life round. And I thought, yeah. He said, but other people don't want to make that change. I said, you don't know that. They maybe have not been given that opportunity to change. So I think it comes with opportunity, and alongside Housing First, you get that wraparound care. What can we do for people to ensure they don't go back on the street, which goes back to Michael's point in Rains Park, that if he keeps seeing people cropping up and up, are they getting that targeted support to ensure they can move on with their life?
Max, thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes to go, but I'm going to fit in Tom in Kilburn. Hello, Tom.
Hello, mate.
Hi.
I was just wondering, are you not safer in prison than you are in the streets? And would it not be better to put people that are homeless in prison and then get some kind of system to help them when they come out?
You will see already those that have been released quite recently in Labour's scheme to free up some places in prisons that people are reoffending just to go back because they've got nowhere else to go. There was an interview that I think went viral on social media where the bloke said, yeah, if I don't find anywhere in a week, I'll just go back, because unfortunately it's seen as a better prospect, because and this is the thing with breaking the law, you're a bum on the outside once you've broken the law. You can't get work. You can't move on with your life. The criminal record's hanging over you. You've got to declare it and can't move on. If you're inside, you might be a somebody. You get your 3 meals a day. There is an element of warmth. Don't get me wrong, totally overcrowded, riddled with rats, very dangerous and violent. But once you looked away in your cell, that's that.
Are you both optimistic about the prospect of alleviating poverty, reducing poverty, maybe not eradicating it, but do you feel a sense of optimism or not, John?
I feel optimism because I think that after 33 years of the big issue, I think there is a general move amongst politicians, not necessarily the party leaders. I think they're all saying, we're going round in circles here. And I believe that if we do things like what I'm advocating, which is a Ministry of Poverty Prevention and Cure, 80% of all the money spent on poverty is just to hold your hand. The biggest increase in housing spend recently, the biggest increase ever, has been on money going to landlords to pay for rent of people who are living in temporary accommodation, all these sorts of things. And I think there is a real move amongst many of the businesses and individuals that I speak to who are looking for a new kind of government rather than what we've got now.
Matthew, are you optimistic?
I think I have to be. And you have to have hope or you'd give up. I think I'm very passionate about helping people, and I will fight whilst there's air in my lungs to get in rooms where hopefully people can make change and give people opportunities until there's no one left to help. We've got to do it.
Well, Scott says, I would appoint Lord Bird as Housing Minister. Now, there's a thought. Eamon says, hats off to Matthew. He's such a well-adjusted and coherent commentator on these issues, and it's so impressive. So you've got a fan, Matthew?
Thank you, Mum.
I don't think your mum's called Eamon, but well, I hope not. Anyway, thank you very much to the both of you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I know from the texts that have come in, everybody else has found it so as well. And thank you very much indeed. Now, coming up in the next hour, someone who I've called a crusty Conservative MP, Christopher Chope, has claimed that party leadership favourite Kemi Badenoch is, quote, preoccupied with her own children. I mean, how very dare she? The long-serving MP for Christchurch in Dorset said, you can't spend all of your time with your family at the same time as being leader of the opposition. Did he say that about David Cameron in 2005, who I think had 3 children himself at that time? Does he say it about Robert Jenrick, the man who he's supporting in the campaign, that also has 3 young daughters? Well, the answer is no, he doesn't. How can these attitudes prevail in 2024 in the UK?
On your radio, on Global Player,